Good morning, friends and family. It is Citizen Stewart. Today is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you'll be freer after this hour with me and Sharif El Mekki on our weekly update on what is happening with Black education, Black history, Black news. Today we're going to talk about the 10-point program of the Black Panthers. It is the 55th anniversary of their 10-point program. If you were born on the day, October 15th, 1966. You would be 55 today if you were born on the day that the program was created. We're going to talk about it today and figure out what kind of relevance does it have still for today. And we're going to have a very special guest today. Khalid Rahim is going to be joining us, who's actually a Black Panther Cub, like Sharif El Mekki is, and also has a lot to offer in terms of what we can know today about the importance of the 10-point program. Welcome, friends. It's Freedom Friday, where we learn in peace, but sometimes I choose violence. And I need to stop saying sometimes, because at least 3 times a day I choose violence. On behalf of the children of the world, there will be no adult peace if we don't have child justice. And that is what my activism is all about. Welcome, Brother El Mekki. How are you doing?
Great, man. Good to see you. And yeah, it's if you're going to choose violence, make it in defense of the children, right? So the Watoto makes sense, and it's appropriate.
It's appropriate. I mean, the African Maasai tribe thing that I ask all the time about how are the children is a way about around centralizing the needs of children, and it's a way in which we don't act anymore in the United States. I've said this many times. If you look at the child policies of the United States or any state that you live in, wherever you live, look at the child policies and ask yourself, are these policies in sum total, when you read them, a declaration of how much we love kids or how much we don't care about kids? And I would say it's unfortunately the latter. Today we'll be talking about the 10-point program. And you just reminded me that Brother Raheem is not a Panther Cub. He's an actual Panther.
hmm hmm
And I think
Once
these
a Panther,
distinctions matter.
always a
So
Panther, right?
there you go. And I also mentioned it's the 55th anniversary. So
Yeah.
it kind of went by with little fanfare, bro. What do you think is the problem there? What happened that we just had this 55th anniversary of a major set of ideas put forth by the Black Panthers that didn't get much fanfare?
Yeah, there we had a celebration and some panels, some community-based events here in Philly. It rotates.
Hmm. Hmm.
Next year the annual meeting of the National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party will be in Detroit. This year was, we had a banquet, some panels, community events, a reunion, here in Philly, and it was just, I mean,
Of
it's
course, y'all did in Philly. Y'all do everything in Philly.
Well, I mean, they bounce around. So the folks who were there, they were from all
From
over,
all
and
over.
members
Okay.
from members from the New York chapter and uh, Maryland and other, plenty other cities,
Yeah.
Chicago, elsewhere. They all converged here. Had some things on Temple's campus, and it really just talked about like the relevancy and how it continues and how and it just continued to learn some things, that things that they were doing, that they were thinking. And one thing that always strikes me was how young most of them were,
Hmm.
right? Like that's the piece that just always strikes me. Here are the 16, 17, 19-year olds who are saying like, hey, you know what? This is what needs to take place for our communities.
It's
And that
funny.
focus is important.
You should always remember that most of our
Hmm.
movements involve young people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of our movements, and you know what? To be very honest with you, and I don't want to take this a different direction, but when we talk about the so-called founding fathers of the United States,
The
and
founding terrorist.
the listen, see, I want people to already know that I'm in an undisclosed location. Y'all can tell by my background, because knowing what I was going to do for today's show, I was like, COINTELPRO is not going to find me today. So To hell with COINTELPRO. Y'all notice that my background's a little different. I'm in some, I'm in a secret location for this discussion. But with the framers, it's another group of people where we have lionized them so much that we forget how young they were. I mean, they were as young as 19 years old in that constitutional convention, and a lot of the people in history were very young. Today, we got to stop sleeping on youth. And you just mentioned another good reason: Black Panther Party, SNCC, a lot of the civil rights movement relied heavily on young people as the lifeblood and the reality check for their work. I see we have Brother Raheem in. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing fine. How are you both? I'm glad I could get here this morning. I'm glad I can be amongst you this morning. I hope you can hear me clearly. I hope you can see me clearly. And I apologize for the delay as far as being able to sign on.
No, we hear you just fine, and thank you for joining. You're here when you're here, so we appreciate you being on this morning. We're trying
Great
to
to
get some
see you.
clarity. We're trying to understand history, our present, and our future. And as we were just talking about, it's the 55th anniversary, October 15th, 1966. There was the Black Panther 10-point program that was written that had 10 points in it that seem just as relevant today as they were then, maybe with some changes and some updates. And I would love to talk about that. Love to talk about number one, um, we're having a fight nationally about what we should teach our children in class, in school, and in history. So I would love to hear from both of you all what you think about the relevance of the 10-point, the Black Panthers 10-point program, not just in the past and in history, but what's the relevance of teaching it today to young people, and what should adults today take away from it as adults?
Oh, it's a very interesting set of questions. If I could make a response to something that you had mentioned earlier before I officially came on about the young people from the Black Panther Party and the young people from the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, and the Black Liberation Movement, you're absolutely correct that youth led the way then and they have to lead the way now. But one of my critiques of the Black Panther Party is that at some point we should have found a way to inject and to recruit more older, elder, and seasoned community organizers and activists and leadership, because I think that would have perhaps curtailed some of the things that happened a little later on that led to the demise of the Black Panther Party, not to mention COINTELPRO. I'm talking about our own personality conflicts and our own ego trips and at times our incorrect analysis of our situation, which meant that the folks within the organization, because the leadership had incorrectly analyzed our situation, that meant that we would follow because those
Mm,
were our leaders. So I think that indeed at some point the Black Panther Party could have benefited from having older, elder, and more seasoned leadership um, included within this leadership structure. I also think that one of the things that could have helped us is to have a much more decentralized central committee. In other words, if we had a central committee that wasn't basically made up of people from the West Coast, that it should have been a central committee that would have been much more representative of the Black Panther Party. In other words,
mm,
we would have
mm.
had a central committee that had members from the Northeast, the Southeast, the Midwest, and so forth and so on. I do believe that if Chairman Fred Hampton had lived, he perhaps would have been one of the new members of the Black Panther Party Central Committee. And perhaps with him in his ideas and his approach, perhaps that could have helped us to navigate the waters a little bit better. So I just wanted to respond very quickly to something that you had raised earlier before I came on officially
Yeah,
about the
question
role of
about that.
youth.
Just
Yeah.
a question about that too. So two questions. One, is it that you're saying that it would have been better if there would have been an intergenerational mix from elders and youth and
Yes.
others? Okay.
Yes.
And then the second question about that is, um, there were chapters that popped up all across the country, but those chapters and their leadership weren't necessarily part of the central committee. Is that what you're saying also?
Well, you had the Central Committee, and the Central Committee was basically the chief decision making element within the Black Panther Party. So everything flowed from the Central Committee.
Okay.
Right. And so, yes, you had local leadership. Like in Philadelphia, we had our local leadership. We had the Central Committee for the Philadelphia chapter. Right. And at that particular point, it was Captain Reggie Shell. Right.
Reggie Shell.
Okay. And so you had Captain Reggie Shell, and then you had our communications secretary, which was Brother Sharif's mother. Right. She was our communications secretary at that time. Okay. And then you had our section leader. My section leader was a brother that we call Brown, because I came from the West Philadelphia section. And Brother Sharif's dad was also part of the leadership. Okay. So, yes, we had local leadership, but we had regional leadership, for example. A brother that you may have heard about or read about who was confronted, with Sister like Assata Shakur up in New Jersey on the Turnpike, and he passed away. We're talking about Brother Zayd Malik Shakur. Well, Zayd Malik Shakur was actually the minister. He was the deputy minister for information for the East Coast section of the Black Panther Party. And so he would come down to Philly and he would visit us from time to time. And sometimes people would go up to New York as well. Right. So we had national leadership, we had regional leadership, and we had local leadership. But the national leadership was mostly West Coast. Okay. And I think that we should have been much more diversified. And I think if we had been much more diverse as far as the regional representation on a national level, it may have helped us to navigate the waters a little bit better when we had to deal with COINTELPRO, and also when we had to deal with some personality conflicts within our national leadership.
Okay. So, so point well taken on the need for intergenerational movements and for a party. We have learned a lot since then because there have been declassified documents. There have been insights that have been gained in the 55 years since the Black Panther Party was really trying to make a move, and the United States had a response to that move. It could teach us a lot today, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about it. What is the relevance of looking at the Black Panther Party for young people today in terms of teaching them their history, teaching them the ups, the downs, the goods, the bads, the uglies, and then making it relevant for what they're facing today? And maybe we'll start with just the Black Panther Party and then get into the 10-point program, the relevance of that. But let's just start there. Let's talk about it. Young people today needing to learn this history and maybe don't know that they need to learn it. What's the relevance for them, and how can it have an import for their life today?
Well, I think that first of all, the so-called educational culture here within the United States of America is basically apolitical and is ahistorical. And in other words, the culture here lends itself to people not having long-term memory. In other words, the things that are reinforced in this particular culture now and then is that you should always focus on what's happening today, maybe what happened yesterday, but let's not go too much further than that. And so oftentimes people don't really learn their history. People don't know the history of their own family because people haven't been taught how important it is, right? So let alone understanding and knowing the history of your people's struggle for freedom and liberation, and how it may have looked before you were born, right? We live in a culture that is very youth-centered and very youth-oriented, and it's not really focused on understanding the past as much as it is focused on understanding current trends. So yes, it is important to understand not just the history of the Black Panther Party, but the history of the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, and the Black Liberation Movement as well. Oftentimes, I break those down into three different components. Many people sometimes just lump everything together and they say either the Civil Rights Movement or they may say the Black Power Movement. But I see those as three distinct movements that are characterized by three distinct politics and mindsets. And like there is some overlapping, but I look at them as being different. I think that the Black Panther Party represented, in many ways, the highest form and the most militant and revolutionary expression within the Black liberation movement. And when I look at the Black Power movement, I see the Black Power movement as being much more representative of the limited success of the civil rights movement, because it opened up the door for some Black people, most of whom were already prepared because they represented components of the Black middle class and the upper Black working class, who could find entry into predominantly white institutions as far as colleges and universities, corporate America, entertainment, and so forth and so on, and also politics. And so that's how I characterize the Black Power movement. Yes, when it came in, it was about Black pride and some degree of Black militancy, but it was not necessarily about Black revolution. And I look at groups like the Black Panther Party, the Republican New Africa. Those are the groups that basically symbolize and epitomize the call for revolutionary change, not just reformist change, but fundamental, substantive revolutionary change. And then when I look at the civil rights movement, that's exactly what it was. It was a movement for inclusion, that Black people's humanity be recognized, and that Black people be afforded the same power and privileges as any other citizen here within the United States of America. So Black people were fighting and advocating for our civil rights as human beings, but our civil rights, not necessarily looking to push the envelope all the way across the table for some fundamental reconstruction or reconstitution of the power relationships and the structured systems and institutions that govern us. That was left up to people like Malcolm X and Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and others. It was left up to them to make that type of declaration. In other words, that revolutionary declaration. And so again, I see three different distinct periods, even though they interlap or they overlap and they reinforce one another: civil rights, Black power, Black liberation. And so today what we find is a resurgence of Black liberation, which is very important because Black liberation has to push back, right, against the elements of Black power that had been co-opted. Okay. And so that was very important. And then the elements of Black liberation have to push back against the civil rights folks to correct the historical narrative. Like everybody wasn't with Dr. King, just like everybody wasn't with Malcolm X. A lot of the so-called, people my age and older who celebrate Dr. King, when Dr. King was walking amongst them, they hated Dr. King. They used to run away from him. They didn't want to be associated with Dr. King, especially in the last couple of years of his life, when he came out and he spoke against U.S. imperialism, and he condemned the U.S. role in Southeast Asia. They didn't want to be associated with Dr. King. They lukewarmly embraced him when he was just focusing on civil rights. But when he started talking about human rights, and when he started to align himself politically more with Malcolm than anybody else, they was running away from Dr. King. But now some of them same old timers are standing up now proclaiming that they walk with Dr. King. They ate with Dr. King, and then they would have took a bullet for him too. No, they wouldn't. They was trying to get away from King as quickly as they could. So again, I think it's important for the Black liberation element to push back against the neo-colonial elements within Black power, and also to correct the historical narrative coming from the civil rights movement as well.
That's a lot.
That is.
That's a whole lesson in itself.
It. And can you just say that again? Civil rights, Black liberation, and Black power. Those are the three.
Yeah. And basically, I would put them in a different sequence: civil rights, Black power, and then Black liberation. And then, and also when you speak with, or you read the histories and the historical narratives of some of the freedom fighters who are still living today, and even those of us who have passed on, oftentimes when you read the narrative and when you talk to them, they kind of give you that history. They like express it that way. They talk about how they started out with the NAACP, then at some point they got involved with the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton is a prime example. Mark Clark as well. A lot of people skip over Mark Clark. We need to talk about the defense captain for Peoria, Illinois chapter, Mark Clark, who just happened to be visiting in Chicago when that happened, and he was murdered by the pigs, right? But that was a trajectory. Oftentimes, the people from that era, they came from the street, they came from the college campus, or they came from some type of civil rights initiative, or perhaps
Mhm.
a Black student group or organization. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale is a prime example of that. And that usually was the trajectory. It was civil rights, Black power, Black liberation, or civil rights to Black liberation, or Black power to some degree to Black liberation.
I heard you make a different distinction too, though, between reformist change and revolutionary change.
Right,
You talk a
right.
little bit more about what falls into the camp of the reformist and what falls into the camp of the revolutionary in terms of our activism. When we think about activism, what would you put in each of those camps?
Well, we have a lot of folks today. They all use the same terminology and they use the same language, right? So people talk about, yeah, we're gonna push back against racism, we push back against white supremacy, we condemn police misconduct, we condemn police brutality. But even though we all can agree on the things that we're fighting against, where we have the conflict is when we start having serious conversations as far as what we're fighting for. And there is the difference. Because if you're fighting basically to make peace with white supremacy, you ain't no revolutionary. All right.
Mm.
And oftentimes that's what we see. We see people who are held up and people who are pushed out in front of the masses of people who they use the same language that the revolutionary class uses. But if you have a deep discussion, what you find out is that they don't really want to change the United States. They don't want a revolution. They just want to find a way to make peace with white supremacy, so white supremacy can stop kicking their behind, right?
Hmm.
And so those are the things that I would look at, right? Just don't get caught up into the rhetoric. Just don't get caught up into the symbolism. Just like today, we have people who they love to embrace and they love to misappropriate the symbology or the symbolism of groups like the Black Panther Party, right? But when you talk with these people, you see their politics don't reflect the Black Panther Party at all. Their politics is something else completely. Sometimes it's reactionary Black nationalism or right-wing Black nationalism, and sometimes it's just a whole bunch of foolishness, right? I remember a few years ago, I was at a demonstration, and it was some young folks. There was a lot of young folks there, and they were protesting. It was a pretty powerful demonstration. And then there was some discussion about supporting some of the presidential candidates. And then some young people got on the mic and they started reciting the mantra from Assata Shakur, right? It is our duty to win, so forth and so on and so on. And then they went on to implore people to register to vote for this dude. It might have been Bernie Sanders. It might have been Hillary Clinton.
It was probably Bernie.
So
Sanders.
what I did, I wasn't trying to bust nobody's bubble, and I wasn't going to be disrespectful, but I just, I walked up and I nudged this young brother, and I tried to politely remind him that Sister Shakur was neither Democratic Party member nor one of those type of folks. That she was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he just looked at me like I was crazy. But to me, that's an example of the type of foolishness that goes on that many of us are not aware of. You're going to go to a march, go to a demonstration, go to a rally, implore the mantra coming from Sister, Assata Shakur in order to encourage the masses of Black people to vote for someone who basically supported a bounty being put on her head and having her extradited back to the United States to stand trial, or not to stand trial, but to continue to serve life. Right. So, you want to use her words, right, in order to encourage our people to vote for someone who basically wants to kill her or put her back in prison. And so that's the foolishness and craziness. And I'm talking about Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders basically was one of those senators who supported Assata Shakur being extradited or turned over from Cuba once the United States was trying to soften its relationships with Cuba. He was one of those senators who had agreed that perhaps as a precondition for that they should turn over like Assata Shakur, along with some other political prisoners and prisoners of war in Cuba, because Assata is not the only one.
I think a lot of my Bernie loving friends, there you go. I would love you to have an answer for that one.
Hey man, tell them to tune in. I'd love to talk with them too. I just tell them up to their face. Look, check this out. Revolution is revolution. Reform is reform. And to that point, let me say, and this is something that we had talked about, Brother Sharif and I, on Saturday. If you look at the 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party, whether you look at the original 10-point platform from 1966, or you look at the 1972 10-point platform and program, in essence, the 10-point platform and program is a reformist program. It's a reformist document, right? What makes it revolutionary is actually point number 1 and point number 10, especially point number 1, because it qualifies everything that follows from it. See, when you say we want freedom, we want the power to determine the destiny, that's self-determination. That requires revolutionary change. Everything else after that is really a reformist, display, right? But it's qualified by number 1 because, see, listen, you can have reparations, you can have criminal justice reform, you can have the release of political prisoners. You can even say, okay, no Black folks should ever serve in the U.S. military again. You can have all of that and still maintain capitalism and imperialism. You can have all of that and still maintain white supremacy, right? But point number 1 and point number 10, when you talk about point number 1, you want the power to determine the destiny. That doesn't just imply, that makes it clear. This is a call for revolution. And then the last point, when you talk about a plebiscite, that's a call to move this just from the local stage, in the local arena, to the international arena. And that puts the Black community in the same space as other people of color historically who have fought for and demanded their freedom and liberation from an anti-colonial type of perspective. So you're calling for this national plebiscite in which only Black people will be allowed to participate, to take a vote as to whether or not we want to be here as U.S. citizens or we want another type of relationship with the powers that be. So look at the first one. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We believe that Black people will not be free until we're able to determine our destiny. That's profound. That's the revolutionary point within the 10-point platform or program. That qualifies everything else that follows. Because without number 1, all that other stuff is just reformist.
So what would number 1 realistically look like in 2021?
Just what I said, just what you read. It's there. I mean, realistically, that's what it should be. We want freedom. We want the power to determine the destiny of our Black community. That is the most revolutionary point, in my humble opinion, within the 10-point platform and program. Because without number 1,
what would the power to determine our destiny look like, though? I mean, like, so me growing up, like, and having read these things, and Sharif and I have talked about this. I was Black Panther adjacent. Sharif was actual Cub, but all around me were Black men and women who were very enamored with the Black power struggle. But they were going different directions with it. They were pulling from different texts, but the Black Panther Party had a hold of all of them and their psychology at the time. And I represented a different generation, the next generation. So I would look up things. I would look at like this number 1, and it used to, in my mind, in my youngish mind, used to mean to me that we would get a state somewhere, right? Like I remember writing early papers in grade school about a Black state. Like we were going to take over Montana or something, right? Like somebody was going to give us an actual state, and we were going to actually separate in that way, not in a hostile way, but in a way where we knew that we controlled in some ways like the Native Americans do, for instance, right? They have land, territory, they're a sovereign nation that exists within a nation. Is that still a version of what number 1 would look like, or are we talking about something different within the American so-called democracy, the American business class, the American, like how would we exist if we were really controlling our own destiny as the Black community?
I mean, there are various models. I think what you just described is a possible model. I know for the Republic of New Africa also espouses land, independent territory as a basis and as a foundation for genuine Black freedom and liberation. And I support that, and I concur with that reasoning. You can't be free if you don't have power. And if you're going to really have power, you have to be able to control some type of economy. And the basis for any type of economy nowadays and days before, and what I assume is days to come, has to be based on your capacity to feed yourself, clothe yourself, and house yourself, which means you got to have some land. You got to have a land basis somewhere. It can't just be some esoteric thing that's floating between your ears, right? It has to be based on something that is very material. And so there's nothing more material than land. So I concur with the conclusions that were drawn by people like Republican New Africa and to like a certain degree the Nation of Islam. We have to have land. We have to have independent land and territory as a basis and foundation for our material freedom. I'm not talking about so-called political freedoms, because political freedoms we've seen over the last 50, 60 years, not just here within the United States when it comes to Black people, but throughout the world when it has come to people of color, whether it's throughout the continent or in different parts of Central South America and certainly throughout Asia, that political freedom without a material basis is not freedom at all, right? And so that's what we have here within the United States, and we experience it all the time. If you look at, say, in the late 50s and the early 60s, I think we had maybe just a couple of hundred Black elected officials. And now fast forward to 2021, we now have thousands, literally thousands of Black elected and appointed officials, but yet we still don't have any substantive freedom. And so you have to have a material basis to your freedom and liberation. And that's another reason I think profound, because it qualifies everything else.
I love that. Sharif, what do you think about this point number one and the teaching principle, what we teach young people today? Point number one, 10-point program. We want freedom. We want the power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We believe that Black people will not be free until we are able to determine our destiny. There's so much in there about agency and about self-ownership.
Self-determination.
Yeah. So, you're an educator in the classroom. What do you do with this point with young people today?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, like exposing them to it and understanding, like, hey, what's the difference? What would you really be able to do with full self-determination? And looking at the apparatus and who's actually determining how you're being educated, where you're being educated, right? You got zip code locked schools. You got curriculum that promotes white supremacy. You got educators who don't look at you as their replacement or the brothers and sisters of their own children. They look at you as a job and a paycheck, right? And so that in itself, even if I just look at the educational system and I'm using that to, you talk a lot about like, schools not teaching the history of schools. For the students, for their eyes to be wide open and be able to understand and connect the dots, that's exactly what has to happen. So they see like, okay, here's what my aspirations are. Okay, that actually requires a level of self-determination. And what are the binds that are blocking me? What are the barriers? And so they can determine and see that and then push forward. Ultimately, I think a lot of that, when I think about it, I think the land and I think the educational system are two pieces that are extremely important. And if I have to start with one, I'd start, me, I'm going to start with education. And just like, how do we take our schools, build our own schools, and use that as the framework and basis to start that journey towards self-determination. That whole idea of Kujichagulia is just so powerful and important. And it is, in some ways, I think it's actually, probably number one instead of, Umoja, because I think you have to have that self-determination element in order to reach unity. It's hard to be unified if you don't have a basis and understanding of what self-determination is. So, yeah.
One of the things that I always bring into the education debate is that we're not fighting for education reform. So Brother Raheem, I was actually happy to hear you give words to something that I had been thinking, but didn't really have exactly the language for: the difference between the reformist and the revolutionary agenda. In education specifically, there are a lot of people who consider themselves to be education reformers. And I have said endlessly that you can't reform the education system. It is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, what it was designed to do, and it has a 150-year head start on you. So it actually is performing quite well. It is sorting students. It sorts students based upon the best proxies that it has for race and class into education deserts and education islands of privilege. On purpose, it does this. It's the blueprint. It's not a flaw. It's a feature of the system. If you look at the way that it's designed, the way that you enroll kids in the schools, the way that you apportion to them what they get once they get in those schools, the way that you distribute all that's supposed to be good in education is a mechanism. It's a machine. It's systemic. If you look at it, you can't be so juvenile that when you look at it to think that these are all just random acts and random actors. It's a machine. It works well. And it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So reforming that in some ways to me, like I have said previously, is like reforming slavery. You never heard of people say we want slavery reform. We want to lower the number of hours that you work from 12 hours a day to 11 hours a day. We're going to shorten instead of giving you just like a half a piece of bacon a week, we're going to give you a little bit more because we're reforming slavery. No, abolitionists were very clear. Slavery's wrong. Is wrong from the get-go. You don't reform this. So that's what I feel about the education system is the revolutionary principle of education is we would radically change it to make it around human development of the individual and taking into special consideration the history and the lives of historically marginalized people who have been marginalized by systems of oppression, systems, racist systems, white supremacist systems, colonial systems, and whatnot. We would take all those things, all those lenses into account when we recenter the whole thing around the individual child, right? That would be a radical reformation that goes wrong way before reform. But to your point, Sharif, that you were just making as you were talking, I was thinking the thing that we should be fighting for, the application in the 10-point program that I see here for education, is we have to rebuild our educational capital. We don't own the educational means of production for our own children. And education is the means of production in education is human development. It is the thing that develops your humans. And we are turning that over and outsourcing that to a group of people that hate us and have always hated us. So to me, the strategy would be build schools. And you all have just added something in this conversation. I think indigenous people in the United States have always said, like they have always been clear about the power of land. That's one thing. And when I look at Native Americans,
Hashtag land back or something like that. I forget.
Right.
I used to wonder why they focused on it so much. I was like, y'all in the middle of genocides and got all kinds of other stuff going on, but they focus heavily on land.
Listen, if we build a school on other people's land, that school ain't going to survive, and we got to keep in mind as well that there were some folks who wanted to reform slavery, but they were the enslavers. They said, hey, let's reform this a little bit. Let's give them a little extra. So they stop running away. So they stop rebellion. So they stop resisting. So they stop organizing. So yeah, they wanted to reform it, not end it. They're just like, oh, let's tweak it a little bit, but not end it.
It's a very good point. In terms of education, first of all, let me give a little shout out because I'm originally from West Philly. I'm a West Philly guy at heart.
Tell him, Unc. Tell him.
So I'm originally a West Philly guy at heart, right from down the bottom, right? This where his parents is from too. So check this out. I got to shout out to Overbrook High School, and I need to apologize to Overbrook High School. This is a 50-year plus overdue apology. I went to Overbrook High School. I should have attended more classes. I should have did everything I was supposed to do, but I didn't. So I apologize to Overbrook High School, but it was the Black Panther Party that literally saved my life in terms of my educational development. I was able to participate in the political education classes as well as the Liberation School. And then at some point, I was able to teach in Liberation School. And that was very profound for me, considering my track record at Overbrook High School, which was not very good. But the Black Panther Party gave me a reason and a cause to open up books and to think and to study and to read. You couldn't be a member of the Black Panther Party if you couldn't read the Black Panther paper. And you couldn't be a member of the Black Panther Party without participating in political education classes. And so, that was very helpful for brothers like me, brothers and sisters like me, who had some other personal challenges, family challenges, social challenges around education. Now, when it comes to education, let me say this again. Education is a function of the people in power. And education is a function of the type of economy that the people in power have. For example, and I'm sure you all know this, but just to illustrate, I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, many of the high schools were constructed not so much as to prepare people to go to colleges and universities. They were constructed to prepare people to work in the steel mills and to work in the coal mines. And so once those industries and once those type of institutions started to decline, then there was a scramble about, well, what kind of educational system are we going to have? How is it going to benefit our children, our grandchildren, so forth and so on. And then we could take it back even further. We know that public education, oftentimes we think of it as a right, and it should be a right. But originally, public education was constructed because they needed to have a more able-bodied workforce, because the United States economy was, at least in the North, was making a transition from being a trade, mercantile, agricultural-based economy into a manufacturing-based economy. And so they needed to get these guys off the farm and into the factories, right? And so they came up with educational systems to help them to do that. And then at some point, the United States needed more brain power. They found a way to get the guys off the farms, away from the factories forever, and into some colleges and universities and trade schools. So education has always been a function of those in power to serve their interests, right? And so we have to always keep that in mind. Again, I live in Pittsburgh, PA now. And so even though people still refer to Pittsburgh as the Steel City, steel is not the mainstay of the region's economy anymore. Now it is the educational system, because it has some of the best colleges and universities, public universities. They have contracts with the government, like Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh, and also some of the best hospitals, UPMC and others. And then last but not least, it's become a technological hub for places like Google and so forth and so on. So now we refer to Pittsburgh as the Ed Med Tech Center. It's no longer Steel City, even though we still use that name out of deference to the past. But those economies, man, have been gutted because of the greed of the capitalists who ran the steel industry into the ground. Rather than take their profits and reinvest it into their workforce and reinvest it into the infrastructure, they took their profits and filled their pockets with it. Meanwhile, their competition in places like Germany and Japan, they did just the reverse. They took their profits and they reinvested into the infrastructure and reinvested into their workforce. So I just want to make that point that education is a function of those in power. It's a function of the economy that those in power control. And so, again, it gets back to number one, freedom, power. We say you can't have freedom without having power, and you can't have power if you ain't free. So they always reinforce one another. Everything flows from that.
Yeah, my assumption is that the regulation of education, having been the state has been obsessive about managing and regulating education in a way to its own benefit. So to your point, I do believe it's always been a social instrument of the social class, the social upper classes, to produce compliant sheep in the lower classes for one purpose or another, for some purpose that suits their needs. But if you look at times during slavery, that education is powerful because they didn't want you to have it.
That's right.
The tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden of slavery was like, yet thou shalt not read. Because if thou read, if you read, you'll be unfit to be a slave, right? So, so the obsessive nature they punished white people harshly for teaching black people to read. Like they made the punishment pretty swift to where it was clear to white folks, like, listen, even if we thought about teaching you to read, we know what the state would do to us for that. And then immediately after, black folks, their obsessive acquisition of literacy tells me that they were clear that there was power in words, power in knowledge, power in books, and in education. And it was probably best for us when they were controlling it. That acquisition of literacy that took place in the shadows. It took place in places out of a white view, because there could be a lot of punishment for actually learning to read and wanting to become educated and uppity. Oh, look at you, you uppity. You want to read. What's wrong with you? You uppity, you know what's, right? And that persists today. We think that's over. We talk about these things as if there was a point in time that there's a demarcation between the before and the after.
Mm.
We don't talk about continuums. Like everything I just said from way back then has a presence today. It has a hiccup, a burp from the past, a thing that still connects us back there. We have this very Western way of looking at these things as if there's like, black and white, up and down, before and after. I mean, how big of suckers are we for these things that show you like, I was fat and then I took this pill, now I'm skinny. We love that before and after way of thinking. The truth of America is that there's a continuation of things in the middle, and we're still living the continuation
Right.
of some of that.
Right.
The way home, I think, is actually starting to own more of the process. Own more of the process. So here's what I got so far. We need the land to be able to do that for one, because land is power. Education is power, but if you build it on a house of sand, if you build a house on sand, it's going to be taken away from you. So build schools on other people's lands or in their facilities. That's probably wrong. A little bit about content, because in the if we go back to the 10-point program, we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. Now
Can't
let's
teach
apply
that in
that to
school.
today's
That's anti-CRT, boy. They get you. Talk about shutting it down. You talk about decadent American system. How they shut this down? They gonna be after you, bro. You better
Talk
stay
about
in
it,
that
Sharif.
undisclosed place.
Talk about it, bro. No, you talk about it. I'm not saying I'm gonna talk about it. I'm saying you talk about it. Now,
No,
like,
I
how
mean,
does
there's
it apply?
absolute, yeah. I mean, and you see even just a little bit when you talk about like just the attacks on even just reforming. And I love that, Brother Raheem talks about this, idea of revolutionary versus reform. We see how the dogs come out just on reform, just a little bit of eating around the edges of, hey, I'm going to teach, about Ruby Bridges, about actually us trying to get into your system. And Tennessee is like, no, you can't teach that. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham, no, you can't teach that. Oh, this idea that there are some isms that continue to perpetuate and students will continue to suffer from. No, you can't teach that. So even the reform. And so then when you connect, and I love it, you're talking about like connecting the dots and seeing that this is a continuum. Then when you see the full might of the American government, the CIA, FBI, etc., and how they unleashed that on the Black Panther Party, because they were basically saying that Hoover said, like, no, they're a threat to our way of being. And what he means by that is they're a threat to white supremacy. Exactly. If people organize around this issue, our whole system is built on white supremacy, and we're going to do everything we can to protect it. So that continuum continues, because ultimately that's their holy grail, is the white supremacy, and any efforts to adjust that, even if it's minuscule and reformist, they're going to come after you. So if they're going to come after you for reforming, you might as well go all in, because they're coming after you anyway. You might as well lean all the way in.
That's right. The brother's absolutely correct. And hey, the whole thing about reform and revolution, when I have a conversation, or when I'm having a talk with people from a religious or spiritual orientation, right? Especially those from the Judeo Christian Islamic orientation, I refer to the story of Moses, right? And I said, when Moses approached Pharaoh, he didn't say, now, whether you believe this is a myth or whether you believe it's actual, that's not the point. I'm just trying to make a point here, just in terms of the politics involved. Moses didn't approach Pharaoh and say, look, I want you to make sure that my people have work breaks, that they have morning meal, afternoon lunch or something. And no, he didn't say any of that. He said, look, let my people go. It was unconditional. It was let my people go. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He was saying, let my people go. Right. And that's the way we have to approach this. And that is the fundamental difference between reform and revolution. Right. We have to make a demand for freedom. And then we have to make that demand. We have to pursue, to quote Malcolm, by any means necessary, what it takes to make that demand a reality, a social and economic reality for us as Black folks, as oppressed people here within the United States of America and elsewhere, anybody else who wants to take up the cause, right? But we have to be firm. Let my people go. Not just $15 an hour, right? Not just subsidized housing, not just changing the laws in terms of dealing with drugs and so forth and so on. All that's good, but fundamentally, let my people go. And
You know
again, that
what?
goes back to point number one. We
Speaking my
want freedom.
language.
We want the power to determine the destiny of our people. Number one qualifies everything else of the 10-point platform and program of the Black Panther Party.
You just mentioned a lot to me. So the Fight for 15 thing, Sharif has heard me go in on Fight for 15,
Mm-hmm.
which so much feels like slavery reform to me. It really
Mm-hmm.
does. Like, we gonna make working at Taco Bell better for you, as one of our major political achievements. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with getting paid more at Taco Bell. That's not my point. My point is, when you spend 80% of your time on an agenda like that, you are not spending the time on the agenda of asking questions like, should Taco Bell exist? Right? Like, like you are dying from eating Taco Bell. Let's just start there. That is not food. That's not beef. They
That's
literally
true.
they have literally been charged in court that that's not beef, right? And you fighting to get paid more to keep selling poison to your own people. That is kind of like never mind. I don't need another analogy, but I'm
But
just saying, we spend
Brother
so much
Chris,
of
you
our
make a
time
good
on those
point.
things.
Yeah, but listen, here's the thing. See, as we pursue revolutionary goals and objectives, we also have to pursue immediate reform for the community and for the people and for ourselves. So we need to pursue some short-term reformist things as well, because the people need relief. The people need relief from their oppression. So the real revolutionary, we understand that. We understand, just as the Black Panther Party had articulated over 50 years ago, survival programs pending revolution. So yes, we have to come up with reformist policies. We have to come up with survival programs because the people need some immediate relief, and we need some short-term success, right? And we can build upon, we can build upon those short-term success and hopefully translate into or transform those into long-term commitment for revolution. But right now, our people have been taking the beating. They're taking the beating, not just materially, they're taking the beating spiritually. And most importantly, our people have been taking a big beating psychologically, right? Our
Yeah.
morale is low. Psychologically, we feel defeated, right? Many of us are suffering from mass depression and we don't even know it. I'm talking about group depression and we don't
Hmm.
even know it,
Hmm.
right? And so we need some short-term victory. So $15 an hour here and there, that's a short-term victory. But we need the voices of people like you to remind us that ultimately $15 an hour is not the goal, that ultimately the goal is revolution. And when we have a successful revolutionary process, then we can have a reconstruction of the economy, and we can
Hmm.
make sure that we
Hmm.
have an economy that
Hmm.
that guarantees that the people consume healthy and nutritious food, right? So we got to
Well,
connect all the dots.
like,
We got to
and
connect
I know
all the
we're
dots.
running short on time here. I'll say this: going back to your original point about having an intergenerational kind of discussion of these issues and how we treat them or whatnot, and a multidisciplinary. We should, instead of buying things like Fight for 15 as presented to us by unions who have crafted it themselves for their own political
Mm-hmm.
purposes, what we
Mm-hmm.
should do is we should say we're going to engage young people and everybody else in the question of Fight for 15, and we're going to take a few things into account. Things like, we're going to talk about the history of unions along with the history of capital. And we're going to talk about the fast food industry and how it relies on welfare to work victims as
Mm.
part of its main part of its labor pool. And we're going to talk about what it means to either participate by making it easier to work there, or not participate by getting our people out of the pipeline to Taco Bell, Arby's, Carl's Jr., McDonald's, and all of that, because that actually for years has worked along with the welfare to work system, feeding mostly women into that population of poverty sustaining work, not poverty ending work. And right, when we talk about workforce development and everything else, we got to get more complicated about these things. And also we need to talk about things like, this is why we would engage everybody in the conversation. Things like, what happens when you pass one of these laws and employers now have to pay a higher amount for people that they used to not pay for? What is the transition that happens, and who stops getting jobs and who starts getting jobs, and what's the complexion look like? Is there any equity principles put into these things so that they monitor who stops getting jobs and who starts getting them once you do this, right? Because I can guarantee you that some economists would tell you that a certain group of people start being locked out the more you do this, and nobody pays attention to it, that the complexion of them changes in those cities, and there's no monitoring of it. Nobody's keeping the numbers on it. Nobody is saying, well, wait a second now. All of a sudden, we have displaced a bunch of Black women with a bunch of weed smoking white college dropouts in some of these same positions. And did that really help us? Well, the unions don't care about that because these are jobs or jobs or jobs or jobs, and they have a post-racial analysis of their economics. So I just gave you what's kind of my take on these things, but I'm saying at least we would engage our people in the deeper discussion and the meaning around these, even if we came to the same conclusion. Even if we were going to do the same thing afterwards, we would say, young people, this is a complex issue. Let's engage you in it. Let's talk about unions and union philosophy, capital and capital philosophies, fast food, welfare to work, cities and city planning, how all this stuff works together. And then maybe we would have a slight change on the way that, like, if nothing else, we would fight for 15 to have a monitoring mechanism within it to make sure that we weren't being dislodged from jobs once you pass these laws in places like Seattle and other places, right? We did find a few things. We found that hours were starting to get cut shorter now. There was fewer full-time hours. Workers were taking on more second jobs because they were having hours cut. And there was a complexion change of who was getting the jobs. This is what happens to us with liberal people all the time. They propose liberal things that have unintended consequences, and they've done it to us in a lot of things like welfare and in education and other places. And then once the problems roll up, it's almost like, well, we had good intentions, right? We had
they had good intentions. You know what? Quickly though, because I know, as you said, we're winding down, or you guys are winding down with the time. When I look at when I look at the struggles that we're dealing with today, I see the struggles that we're dealing with today as a continuation of a struggle that's been going on for centuries in terms of pushing back and resisting white supremacy and economic injustice. At home, we call it capitalism. Abroad, we call it imperialism. We call it colonialism. We call it neocolonialism at home today. But I also see this as a manifestation of a failed revolution. The so-called not so much the civil rights movement, but if we look at the abolitionist movement of the 18th and 19th century, which led ultimately to the Civil War, it failed. It failed because once the Civil War had been won, the United States had an opportunity to do something fundamentally different with the newly freed slaves, or with those, and also with the freed blacks who existed in different parts of the country as well. But the United States didn't do that. And it didn't do that for its own political reasons. I don't want to get into it. I'm sure you guys as teachers and educators, the struggle around Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction period, the sellout that happened in terms of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and so forth and so on. But it failed. And so then we get Black people dealing with all the suffering and pain. And then in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we rise up again. And that failed too, right? And when I say it failed, the movement didn't fail, but the powers that be who said they were going to do the right thing this time didn't do the right thing that time, as they didn't do the right thing in the post-civil rights era, in the Reconstruction era. So here we are again. And we need to be very careful that we don't let these forces do the okey doke to us once again by giving us these false hopes and false promises of real substantive structural change, only to fail us again and have, I won't be here, but to have you guys sitting around here 40, 50 years from now talking about what could have happened and what should have happened, right? We can't go for that again. So what I say to many of us is that one of the biggest obstacles today to genuine Black liberation and freedom is the Democratic Party and the liberal element that exists here within the United States of America, right? One of the biggest obstacles to genuine Black freedom and liberation. And we have to push back against that element. That element is a neo-colonial element. Like I said from the very beginning, they don't want revolution. They're just trying to make peace with white supremacy. And oftentimes it's not a piece for the collective well-being, it's a piece for their individual well-being or for the well-being of their particular family members or clique, right? That's why we have so many so-called Black elected officials and Black appointed officials now. That's why we have so many young people who being duped and misled into thinking that electoral politics for the sake of it is the best way to make some change, and it isn't. Electoral politics is a tool, it's a vehicle, but you got to have a revolutionary purpose and end. If you don't have a purpose or end that is based on revolution, then again, it's just another tool for neocolonialism to further, extract the blood from our community, right? So we got to be careful that we don't fall for the same trick all over again, right? In the 50s and early 60s, we had about 200 Black elected officials. Now we got thousands of them, but we still getting beat up and murdered by the police. We still got failing school systems. We still got mass incarceration, right? We still have disproportionate numbers of Black folks who are poor, disproportionate numbers of Black folks, right, who are miseducated or ill-educated, right? So I'm saying with all these Black elected officials, right, what is the result except for them? They got good paying jobs, they got benefits, they got pensions, right? Their families do okay. They can go on vacations, sometimes once or twice a year. But what about the people who they represent? What about the districts they represent? What about their own constituents? Their own constituents continue to swirl in poverty and oppression while these Black elected officials go to conferences and workshops and travel and make speeches and do book signings and all types of crazy stuff that has nothing to do with improving the material well-being of the people that are supposed to be their constituency. We have to check that. That's cold-blooded neocolonialism, right? We have to check that. We got to push back against that element that exists within our community, especially in cities like Philadelphia. In Pittsburgh, we don't even have neocolonialism. We got colonialism. We've never even had a Black mayor. Now, there's a brother who's in position to maybe become the first Black mayor, and I'm not gonna close the book on him. I know him. He's from the Democratic Party. He's done some good things. And some things is kind of questionable. I may disagree with him sometimes, but we'll see how it pans out, right? But there's an element within Pittsburgh politics that's pushing against him becoming the first Black mayor because they don't want they don't even want a Black face to be the chief executive officer for the city of Pittsburgh. Now in Philadelphia, you guys had Black faces running the city. It still don't mean nothing. I remember one year I was telling some folks up here, I said, look, man, in Philly, they got a Black mayor, they got a Black police chief, they got a Black chief for the fire department, they got a lot of Blacks sitting on the city council, they got a Black superintendent of schools, they got a Black that's in the U.S. Congress, they got Blacks that's in the state house and the state senate. In Philadelphia at that point, if I'm not mistaken, was trying to run a race with Chicago to see which city could close the most schools. Chicago closed 100 schools that year. Philly closed 25 and was trying to close even more. You can correct me if I'm wrong, right? They had shootings and killings that was off the hook. You see what I'm saying? You had people suffering, being beat by the police, being murdered by the police, but all the leadership looked just like the people who were suffering the most. That's neocolonialism, right? We got to push back against that. That is one of our biggest threats to genuine Black freedom and liberation. And not just here within the United States of America, but throughout the African diaspora. If you look at the continent, we see the same type of phenomena. We're seeing people who used to be soldiers pushing back against imperialism, pushing back against colonialism, who are now the puppets of Western imperialism. And they sapped the lifeblood of the people that they had sworn to protect and to help to free and liberate. That was yesterday, but today they puppets for European imperialism, right? So we have to push back against this thing that's happening within our cities, our counties, and throughout the United States of America. We should never forget the 10-point platform and program of the Black Panther Party, and we most certainly should never forget point number 1, right? Point number 1, and we should never forget point number 10 when we call for that plebiscite to be held in which only we can vote, in which we can take our case to the United Nations, in which we can take our case to the World Court, and we can decide for ourselves. Do we want to be an independent nation? Do we want to be a sub-nation within the larger nation? What kind of political or economic or any relationship at all are we going to have with the United States of America from that moment on. But it should be left up to us. And that's where point number one comes in, the point that emphasizes self-determination for the 45 to 50 million Black folks who reside here within the United States of America. But I'm going to say it again. The biggest threat right now to any genuine Black freedom and liberation is coming from the so-called liberals and progressives and most members of the I'm going to say most members of the Democratic Party. You got a few exceptions, Charles Barron, Inez Barron up in New York, and a few people like that. Those are like the exceptions to the rule. But the rule is that within the Democratic Party establishment, neocolonialism runs rampant, and it has to be challenged and it has to be dismantled. I'm going to say that's one of the reasons we started the New African Independence Party as an independent Black political party that pushes radical revolutionary politics as embodied in groups like the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, and SNCC, and so forth and so on. So all power to the people and free to land on that note.
Whew. Well, I feel like, first of all, that's a word, that's a lot. And you just gave us our next show. Sharif, that will be our next show right there, I think, in a nutshell.
Oh yeah, I just want to, thank you again, Brother Khalid. My parents loved you, adore you. My cousins love you and adore you, and I just appreciate, all the decades of sacrifice and commitment and love that fuels all of your work. Folks in the audience who want to hear more, you can get Brother Khalid Rahim's books. He has 3. So please, pick those up. You can find them. One I've started is the Dare to Struggle one, is some of his personal memoir. So I've started, reading that, and it was great seeing you last week, and I'm grateful, honored, and feel blessed to be able to spend time with you again today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Brother Chris. It was a pleasure listening to you. Very insightful. It's an honor to meet you for the first time. And I hope when I get back down to Philly again, we all can hook up and go get something to eat or something.
Absolutely.
A cup of coffee, tea,
it's gonna
juice.
Happen. It's gonna happen.
Make sure we don't go to Wendy's or Burger King's to Taco
Bell. No. We're gonna get some real food.
Get some real food.
Absolutely.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for this show. I appreciate you all. For people listening and watching, we thank you for spending your time with us on a Friday. We are going to send you one of Brother Rahim's books. For the first 5 people to email me right now, you are going to get a copy, and we're going to send it out to you. So email me, chris@brightbeamnetwork.org. First 5 people right now, you'll be in the running. This is like a Hunger Games sweepstakes. So start your typing right now as we speak. We appreciate you all. Have a great Friday, a great weekend, and let's get back next week to the work of supporting our young people. We appreciate you.
Our Father sends us